Welcome everyone to our discussion this evening. I'm Professor Sarah Churchwell, Chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this evening's event, which is the latest in the school's Open for Discussion series, an annual series of conversations convened by experts at the school that brings multidisciplinary humanities perspectives to bear on critical social issues, looking especially at the human dimensions frequently overlooked in current public and policy debates. Each conversation features thought leaders and humanities researchers in wide-ranging discussions that present questions of policy, practice, and opportunity. The focus of this year's series has been those things that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to see more clearly. That includes not just obviously the direct effects of the pandemic, but also the political, social, and civic consequences and the disruption all around us. And some of the topics that we've been thinking about include Black Lives Matter, digital poverty, privacy rights, the importance of communication, the value of the arts and heritage sectors, and the types of knowledge needed to confront global challenges. In particular, we've been hearing a lot lately about the importance of building back better. And tonight, I wanted to ask our distinguished panel to help us reflect on what history might teach us about how to build back better in political terms or social terms after the pandemic, or perhaps through the pandemic since we're not finished with it, or rather it's not finished with us. So my question really is, how are we going to learn what better looks like? We talk a lot about future scoping and horizon scanning, but we can't learn from the future. We can only learn from the past. My starting point this evening was actually George Orwell's familiar warning that those who control the past control the future, and those who control the present control the past. And that's why I thought it would be a good idea to invite a stellar panel tonight who know a great deal about the past in order to reflect on these issues with us. And I'm going to introduce them now in alphabetical order. So first, we're delighted to welcome Professor Peter Frankopan, Professor of Global History, Director of the Oxford Center for Byzantine Research, and Senior Research Fellow at Worcester College. He is the author of the best-selling The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, and also its follow-up, The New Silk Roads. And he's running a New Silk Roads project at King's College, Cambridge. And maybe he'll tell us more about that in our conversation. Our next guest is Dr. Carrie Lee Merritt, who's an independent scholar and the author of Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South. She's working on a new multi-episodic Civil War documentary, which is the first since Ken Burns. And I was saying, hard as it is to believe that people other than Ken Burns can make Civil War documentaries. It's great to know that you're working on that. I'm really excited for it. And she also has a new book in progress. Next is Professor Sunny Singh, Professor of Creative Writing and Inclusion in the Arts at London Metropolitan University. She's recognized as a preeminent decolonial public intellectual, one of the UK's leading champions for inclusion across all aspects of society, decolonization, social justice, equality, and representations. She's the author, most recently, of the novel Hotel Arcadia and a book about Amitabh Bachchan, which I think she's going to be reflecting on in her remarks tonight. And then last but not least, to say the least, Dr. Zoe Samudzi, who is a new doctor. She has just defended her dissertation and gained her PhD, which she holds in medical sociology from the University of California, San Francisco. Her dissertation work, which she has just successfully defended, was about German colonization, European biomedicine, and the 1904 to 1908 genocide of Herero and Nama and San peoples in what was then German Southwest Africa. She is a 2021 fellow with the Secrecy, Power, and Ignorance Research Network, where she is researching the politics and semiotics of white internationalism. And she will be a postdoctoral research fellow with the Actions Program at UCSF. So I'm really excited to welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm particularly excited to hear what happens when we put all of your different expertises and perspectives into conversation with each other. The question we're asking tonight is not, can history strengthen democracy, because I decided to take it as read that historians would think that it has at least something to say. But if you think that's wrong, please speak up. But first, I want to ask each of our speakers to address the question that I did put, which is how can history strengthen democracy? So what I'm going to do is ask each panelist to offer 5 to 6 minutes of reflections on how the history or area, which as you heard is also geographic in some cases, how that expertise or area of research that they study can help us think through some of the challenges that are facing democracies today. So Peter Frankopan, I'm going to ask you to kick us off.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's wonderful to see you again. I'm sorry we're not doing this live. You know, it's great that we can do this on Zoom, and I'm sure there are people from all around the world who tuned in who wouldn't be able to get into wherever we'd be meeting otherwise. But that human contact of being able to talk before, after, and to people who've attended, I'm sorry that we're on Zoom, but thanks anyway. I've got a cold beer sitting on the side that I might crack into when I finish my few minutes to get going. So look, it's a terrific question. When you got in touch with me, I thought, and in fact hoped, that the question would be, how does democracy strengthen history? Because there are all sorts of ways in which history needs to be democratized more than it is. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit today. But I guess as a starting point, I should probably put my hands up and say I'm absolutely the wrong person to try to even answer a question like this. My interest as a historian are primarily pre-modern period, I guess, looking at worlds east of Venice, none of which are democracies. And in fact, the transition in the modern world, in most of the countries that I look at, has been either unsuccessful or non-existent in many cases. So my views on democracy are those of a scholar, if I can call it, or an academic historian, I guess, whose engagement with histories tends to be, and with democracies tends to be, through the lens of engagement of Western societies exporting their value systems into contemporary worlds. And so, you know, I'm probably not the right person to be bringing anything to the table, because in fact, I can make quite a good case to show how enlightened empires have been in the past. Maybe not European empires, and all empires have the same, like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, they all suffer from the same evils in the end. But you know, there were lots of political systems that I've looked at that have been exceptional in their tolerance and their openness and resilience in terms of how the engagements with ethnicities or with religions or with difference. And so my starting point would be, you know, what is it that makes democracy so successful? And you know, although we're amongst friends, I'm not, whether history is the answer. We have a government right now that's shutting down history departments, and in fact dismisses the humanities as being dead-end subjects. So, you know, there's a kind of prevailing view that history can't offer us anything. But I can tell you that societies that have been successful in the past have been ones that have been exclusive, because diversity, as well as being something that is respectful and tolerant, leads to better political outcomes. And so even if you are uncomfortable with the idea of empowering all to have participatory power, there's been a strong correlation in the past towards systems that are able to function in a way where it reduces barriers than ones that push in the other direction. And I suppose, as a sort of cheap shot at Western empires, which are more modern and therefore have had more technological capabilities, when one looks for persecution of women, of people of different ethnic backgrounds, mass slavery, on religious grounds, particularly with things like the Holocaust, you know, a lot of those have happened in the same crucible globally, or perpetrated by people who come from the same crucible as others. And so our concepts, I think, of democracy here in the UK or in Europe or the West, whatever we might define ourselves, are ones where we think that democracy protects us from bad things happening. You know, we think that the lesson that history's taught us is that without full enfranchised democracy, people will persecute each other, will enslave each other, and will take away freedoms. And that's not what history looks like to me. That's not how we've got here. And after all, the greatest genocide of the 20th century that took place with an elected system that was itself democratic in Hitler's Germany, and even states today like China calls itself in its constitution a democratic state. So a lot is in the eye of the beholder of what exactly it is that democracy means. So with that kind of historian's lens, going back, as you know, Sarah, I like taking a long run up into the sandpit, looking back centuries, if not millennia, The reason why we've ended up with enfranchisement is because small groups have pushed their self-interest to promote their own economic interest. That's why Magna Carta happened. That's why the Civil War happened in England. That's why the US War of Independence. It was small groups, in each of these cases, men as it happens, are trying to further their own economic interest by weakening the power of the crown. And so democracy wasn't born out of an idea that we're all equal in front of the eyes of God or in front of the eyes of the state. It was born from that widening of an oligarchical class, that the peripheries have constantly been pushed. So at the end of the First World War, when women weren't allowed still to graduate from my own university, by the way, in 1918, even the extension of political rights towards women, towards something that we would talk about democracy, wasn't an even story and an even pitch until the late 1920s, when finally in the UK there was full voting rights for everybody, regardless of their gender or background. So, I think that was a big barrier that we came through, but it was born out of desperation. It wasn't given away for free. It wasn't given out of an idea of top-down enlightenment being offered. It was done through economic hardship, through the constructs of war, and through the demolition of those special interests that had protected themselves in the first place. So that's the kind of first three quarters of what I'm going to say. I know we've got lots more and much cleverer speakers than I who will say more interesting things. But I guess that reflecting on what it is about democracy that's useful for us all, and I listened very intently when you've spoken so eloquently, Sarah, in particular in the last few years about the United States. The biggest single benefit that we have with democratic systems is that we can vote people out after typically 4 years or so. And that's a right that we take very seriously. It protects us from even people like Donald Trump, in your case, Sarah, voted out closer than everyone might have realized or thought. But that is a successful system that works, that people who are deeply unpopular and divisive do get voted out. And of course, they get voted in too. The big challenge is when we talk about how does history strengthen democracy, is our scorecard right now looks particularly bad. And it may be that history and the way we teach history to young people is part of the problem. But in every single country in the so-called Anglo-Saxon world, by which I mean United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, we can quibble about that label, but it's not my label. There is profound dissatisfaction amongst young people about what democracy means and whether it's a necessary and ideal condition as a political system. That tells me that young people don't necessarily understand the past, or if one was being more generous, we'd say that the level of disenfranchisement economically and socially is so profound that people don't believe that democracy works for them. And I think that's a real challenge we have right now around the world. The lowest levels of confidence in democracy are not in places that we might immediately think. They're in robust, rich countries which feel that democracy isn't working. It's places like the Anglo-Saxon world, Western Europe, Latin America, where particularly amongst young people, but across all demographics, confidence and belief that democratic works is going downwards. And I think we historians have to work much harder to explain that when decisions get made wrong by politicians, what the alternatives are. We need to be much brighter at explaining who gets protected and why those outcomes are better. We need to be much better at explaining what diversity means and what its outcomes are. And I think we need to be explaining what inclusive, successful states look like. And one of my pet peeves, I guess, is in the way in which we teach history, is that still it's histories of kings and queens and of wars. That's what we teach in our classrooms. That's what young people learn. The sort of things I'm interested in are what works. How come my Byzantine Empire survived for 1,000 years? What did it do right to avoid rebellion? There was a lot of changeover at the top. Elites always argue about power. But by and large, this was a stable political system that was quite inclusive. Not perfect, certainly not democratic. But what was it about successful societies that have worked in the past? And I guess I suppose like marriage counseling, if you're going to have a young couple about to get married, you probably want them to sit down in front of people who have a relationship that works and say, what is it that's worked? Rather than doing how we teach history, which is to show every single bust up there is and keep saying, you see, people get persecuted. Because that can also be a self-fulfilling ritual. And these discussions we'll have, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today, about these very strange concepts of empire that are we're allowed free speech on the one hand in our universities, but then we have to think about history in a certain way, seems to me a completely loss of the plot of disengaging of what it is that that history means. So for me, the idea about what democracy even is tied up with what the question of what is history and how should we be thinking about the past in different and more inclusive ways. As it happens, and I will be quiet now, as a global historian, you know, part of my role is to go and look into parts of the world that I have never been exposed to, and to bring myself, you know, to keep learning. And as an academic historian, those incentives are extremely low. You know, once you're in a position academically teaching the Tudors or the 20th century, your ability to step into Mesopotamia or to the world of the Huns or to Southeast Asia before the arrival of Islam are negligible. And there's no structure for that. So we as historians need to do much better at being more inclusive about our subject and with our colleagues. And I guess that will be a chance to move away from slightly simplistic ideas to say, well, democracies are successful states and non-democracies are not, because that's not actually the case. So in fact, yesterday I've been involved all day in precisely the discussions. Over the last 30 years, the most successful economic states have been ones that are not democratic. They've delivered better outcomes for their citizens in terms of economic output, and in some cases, legally as well. And I think we need to be much sharper about understanding what rights and freedoms mean in which part of the world, and not just fall back on our own assumptions that the way we do things is exactly right. Otherwise, as my colleagues in other parts of the world will point out, we wouldn't have movements like Black Lives Matter. We wouldn't need them in places like the United States or the UK, because we'd have engaged and dealt with those kinds of challenges and problems in the past. So that's probably a couple of minutes too long, but I'm going to crack my beer open now.
Well, thank you very much. That was not too long at all, and fascinating. And I'm sure we will pick up on a lot of those topics indeed. Next, alphabetically, is Carrie Lee Merritt. Carrie Lee, do you want to offer your thoughts?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being here, and a big thank you to Professor Churchwell, who I really hope to meet in person soon, one of these days. So my work is obviously based on America, and primarily on the American South in the 19th century South. As Sarah said, I'm working on a new Civil War documentary, but my first book was looking really at the antebellum period. And for those of you who don't know, the South is not only the most undemocratic region in the US, it's also the poorest and the most unequal. And those two aspects are very, very closely correlated. You know, they correspond primarily because these are the areas that had the highest percentages of enslaved people prior to the Civil War. You know, this is the Deep South, this is the Cotton South, the Rice South, the Sugar South. And these are also the states that right now, within the last year, even post-Trump, the states of the old Confederacy that are leading the way currently in adopting new laws that are intended to greatly, greatly restrict voting rights, particularly among areas that are or becoming primarily Black or brown, or primarily immigrant in a lot of cases. So despite this long, almost PR campaign of America being this great democracy, I found throughout my work in the antebellum period, in the Jacksonian era, where every white man in America is supposed to be, getting suffrage and being able to vote, that this is just simply not the case. America has never been a democracy, and it still isn't in a lot of ways, a lot of really important ways. And I think that we can use history in order to find out, like Peter was saying, what does work, what strategies work. And in the Deep South, there are lots and lots of examples of this. And so, I look at poor whites in my first book, and these are white people in the Deep South that don't own land and don't own enslaved people. And so I wanted to know, how they voted and were they involved in the voting process? And what I found was that they really weren't in a lot of cases, that even during this era of supposedly, all white men voting in America, people were restricted from voting primarily because of poverty, but also because of their stances on things like slavery. And I found that all of these issues that people associate with Jim Crow and barriers to voting for Black people in America actually have an even longer history of disenfranchising poor people in America, and even poor whites, from things like local residency requirements, which of course are very, very hard for poor and working class laborers who have to constantly move in search of work and in search of short-term labor and jobs. They were also disenfranchised historically in America, and particularly in the South, because of prior arrests or jail or prison time served. So these are the poorest people in America, in the region, that are disenfranchised, essentially. Poll taxes have such a long history, and again, have always been used to make sure poor people in America are not voting. And so I think another theme that is actually much more common than all of these kind of statutory ways to disenfranchise people, but probably not as documented, is the sheer violence. And in the American South, this is constant, this racist violence, but even violence against people, white people who were banding together in solidarity and trying to vote with Black people once the Civil War was over. So we really need to I think, reinterpret violence in a lot of different ways and look at the role of violence in preventing democracy and how to fight it that way. I think what we're seeing right now, unfortunately, in America, is that the entire South is essentially adopting these new laws that I'm talking about that disenfranchise so many poor white and Black and brown people. And what's going to happen is these laws are eventually going to be adopted in the West as well. And so outside of the coastal areas in the West and the little North Atlantic, New York, New Jersey area, in the entire country of America, most states in America are going to be fighting back against these laws. And whether it's in Reconstruction or during populism, or even during the 1930s and 40s with communist and socialist movements in America and into the civil rights movement, there is a lot to learn. So I'm sure we'll get into that discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as you know, that's all stuff that I'm thinking a lot about as well. And it's always so fascinating to be able to hear people who are working on similar stuff, but from different angles. And it's one of the great joys of what we get to do. Next up is Professor Sunny Singh. Sunny, can you share your thoughts with us?
Yes, hi. First of all, really lovely to be here. Lots of familiar faces and faces I haven't seen in a long time, which is particularly joyous. So delighted to be here. Now, I have a rather strange take on history because I'm primarily a fiction writer. So I come to history from the point of view of what not necessarily it can tell us, but how is it used? How do we write it? How do we present it? How do we look as societies at our past, and not just as a past that exists, but the past that we construct and reconstruct over and over again. And it's a curious phenomenon for me because I am more interested perhaps in those who are disenfranchised. This is partly a personal take because I was born in what was then called third world countries, a former colony of Britain, and I've spent most of my life in former colonized lands, sometimes still colonized lands, such as the States. But I think it's worth thinking about what is it that we think when we talk about a democracy. And I think the simplistic way is to say, well, people are disenfranchised, so they don't go out and vote, sort of picking up a little bit on Peter's point, or it works for a small group of people. But I think when we start considering democracy in its most expansive sense, rather than as political structures which are about, electing a leadership, electing an a legislature, etc. There's something more happening, and I think of democracy as an ever expanding group of enfranchisement, and that is including constantly people who have been marginalized and consistently marginalized. Now, what I find fascinating about this process is for many, many decades, if not centuries, the Anglophone world and sort of the former colonies of Europe have always claimed democratic rights for themselves and democratic status for themselves. But if we start looking globally, those were, let's say, those are little things that are handed out as candy. And this is why I find what I find fascinating is, how do we construct this past? Or how do we construct our history? You know, the constitutionalists, we're going to talk about it in America. This is the great thing. You know, we are the ultimate democracy. We started it off. I find fascinating when in many parts of Europe, people go to ancient Greece as their sort of, it's like, well, maybe we should have a small chat about democracy in ancient Greece. But I think there is a need to construct certain parts of the world. And those are primarily those that have had empires in the last 500 years, as somehow democratic, as somehow, in quote, civilized, as a sort of corollary of that, as somehow better. And therefore, there's an internal logic of exporting democracy, which is something that US is often known to do. It plays very well. For example, you know, a state can claim to be the only democracy in the region. There are ways to say, well, we need to interfere to bring democracy. And there's a kind of an internal issue there. Now, if we stop and say, actually, let's start looking at those who have been historically disenfranchised. What does it mean to them? Why does it matter? What is it? And it's not simply about voting. It's not simply about being able to elect people. It's a much more expansive project. And that project also has elements of economic structures. Justice Brandeis has that wonderful quote around how you can have either great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy. If we expand that to consider what it means for societies that are deeply unequal, and I think the pandemic has exposed that even more clearly, just how utterly unequal globally and nationally at multiple levels we are, democracy then becomes something that cannot exist necessarily alongside capitalism. And that's something we should think about. And democracy, I don't mean this in this kind of liberal Anglophone Western sense, but I mean a democracy that is ever enlarging enfranchisement. It's a democracy or a structure, a political structure that allows the right for self-determination, that allows a personal socio-political, cultural, economic investment into a common cause that we may hold, not necessarily limited by national borders that are artificial, but globally. If we start considering democracy in that sense, I think we are probably likely to find more interesting material from our past, from loose confederations, from different forms of consenting and consensual political organizing and organizations of societies. And I think that's really where, if we think, Sarah, and I want to go back to your idea of building back better, I think that's really what we should be thinking about. That also, of course, as Peter said, we need to look away from, kings and queens. And not just from England. I mean, just any kings and queens, we can move away from them and find something far more interesting. Looking at the sort of processes that people, mass numbers of people came up with. I'm currently looking at the period of 1857, what the Indians call the First War of Independence, the British call the Mutiny. And it's fascinating because there's an incredible range of people who are involved. And of course, the history has been rewritten to make it about a bunch of soldiers who worked for the East India Company who mutinied, or a bunch of quite sort of, small kings and, who rose up and, against the taxes. But the vast number of people who were involved in these really interesting ways, peasant uprisings that happened against the, taxation, but also all sorts of other, for lack of a better word, injustices. To me, the lessons for democracy and how it can be strengthened by, by our knowledge of history are there. They're in the peasant uprisings, they are in the need and articulation of rights and desires and wants and demands of those who are disenfranchised and who have been consistently able to organize themselves repeatedly and over again in face of awful amounts of violence. So going back to Carrie's point, and multiple kinds of violence in order to ask and insist and claim enfranchisement. So that's really, I want to stop there because I want to bring Zoe in, and hopefully we can open it up to conversation. We've had lots of conversations, Zoe, and I just love everything you say. So I'll just pass it over to you.
Great, thanks. And in fact, I won't even, well, I am intervening. I was about to say I won't, and here I am doing it, but I was gonna let you just pass the baton. But absolutely, I'm not gonna lose any chance to say Dr. Samudzi tonight so that you can keep having a public hearing of that. So Dr. Samudzi, over to you.
Thank you so much. Still kind of surreal to hear. So my research is about, I think, the crime of crimes, what we kind of understand is the antithesis of democracy, which is the crime of genocide, the targeting of people for, understood as the targeting of people simply for their identities, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that. My research kind of tries to be a revisionist history and a correction of how we understand colonial history, particularly how we think of this hierarchy of super colonizers of like France, Britain, Spain, and Portugal, and the so-called lesser colonizers in Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands, assuming those colonizers get mentioned at all. Studying Imperial German genocide, specifically the Herero and Nama and San genocide during the 1904 so-called Herero Wars, has offered me some really critical perspectives on otherwise erased and deliberately ignored parts of German statecraft and racecraft, particularly as it relates to anti-Black racism and the relationships between genocidal Nazi fascism and Germany's colonial crimes. So looking at Germany's genocide in Namibia has really deepened my understanding of the coloniality of Nazism, and thinking about Nazism as the settler colonial project. You have these parallels in the eugenic and scientific relationships between anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, and the anti-miscegenation politics that come out of each. The transmutation of Lebensraum as this colonizing practice, first in Southern Africa and then in Eastern Europe, and the corresponding racialization of Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe. And you also see the use of concentration camps and slave labor and genocide as a means of producing cleansed German land. And when you look at Germany's global reputation for atonement, for genocide, it gets laid completely bare when you kind of juxtapose the preciousness of the history of the Holocaust as it should be, and the comparative denial of the Herero and Nama genocide. And the German government was just kind of arguing in court that, while there was violence, genocide was not a crime until 1951. And so it's a little bit hard to call what happened a genocide, but if it happened today, it could be called a genocide, that kind of semantic dance. And I think one of the most useful challenges to the relatively rigid definition of genocide in international law is the Civil Rights Congress Recharge Genocide petition, and where the kind of juridical definitions of genocide are tethered to kind of discrete and bounded events and acute flares of violence. The petition instead describes state processes and structures and international systems of oppression as being genocidal. So in the petition, the authors and signatories, who were all kind of Black leftists, including Paul Robeson, charged the US government with, quote, the mass murder of its own nationals with institutionalized oppression and persistent slaughter of Negro people in the United States on the basis of race, a crime abhorred by mankind and prohibited by the conscience of the world. which also obviously is a crime based on the Genocide Convention. And there are two main arguments in the petition. The first is the killing of members of a group, which is a violation of Article 2 of the genocide. And they offer, quote, killings by police, killings by incited gangs, killings at night by masked men, killing always on the basis of race, and killings by the Ku Klux Klan, despite the universal citizenship that was supposed to have been granted by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The second argument that they offer is an argument of economic deprivation, or per the convention, the Genocide Convention's language, the deliberate inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction in whole or in part. The petition outlines the creation and maintenance of conditions of life in the United States for Black people that were so egregious that Black people were, compared to the rest of the population, deprived of years of life on average. And it describes this trajectory of violence from the transatlantic slave trade to the indignity of the Southern plantation system, to the sharecropping system, to Jim Crow segregation across the country that forced Black Americans into, ghettos or their rural equivalents, into dirty housing, and deprived of medical care and education. And all of these combined violences, the petitioners say, are made possible by what they describe as the emasculation of democracy, the structural prevention of Black Americans from voting and organizing, and the dividing of the American people on the whole, the undermining of mass movements for democracy, and ensuring that there are predatory reactions in politics that are being maintained and perpetrated by state, county, and city governments. So then, as a challenge to the genocide norm, to the norm that is set by the Nuremberg trials, and the Genocide Convention that followed shortly after, the petition highlighted the political limitations of the crime of genocide. And these limitations were emphasized by the emphatic negative response of the American delegation to the United Nations, as well as US politicians, as well as Raphael Lemkin himself, who was the founder and the creator of the term genocide, and who was a legal theorist and attorney who really pushed the adoption of the convention. As member states of the United Nations, the United States would be obliged to respond to the petition. And so a lot of politicians opposed it on the grounds that it would be a violation of American sovereignty if the US were to attempt to interfere in domestic policy, which in plain speak is basically that the maintenance of racial inequality in the United States is an inalienable part of American sovereign power. And this should not be surprising, if we're taking any really honest look at the history of the United States. So then there was widespread panic that if the Civil Rights Congress was successful in lodging their petition, that there would be anti-genocide laws that also criminalized state and non-state practices of white supremacy and racial discrimination domestically, as well as international and transnational racism, which obviously, again, is unnerving because we know that in these non-democracies in the Western world, that exclusion and discrimination are necessary parts of their political structures. In looking at Lemkin's responses to the petition, as well as his own soft denialism of the Herero and Nama genocide, there emerges a very particular relationship to anti-Black violence, namely that anti-Black violence is a necessary part of an organizing characteristic of Western modernity. And in seeking to address and strengthen democracy, that is a foundational feature that has to be attended to. And as we've kind of touched on earlier, Black Lives Matter is really trying to bring that to the fore. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. That was absolutely fascinating, and I won't say exactly what I was hoping for. It surpassed my hopes, but really, really brilliant. I thought I was going to start with one question, but actually from what you've said, it has prompted another question, which I'm going to turn to instead. But first, what I want to do is to encourage, we've already got some Q&A coming in. I want to encourage everyone in the audience, please feel free, don't be shy, ask questions and I'll turn to them shortly. I also want to encourage speakers to respond to each other and not to, I know I've already told them this, not to feel that we're going to have some kind of formal Q&A here. But I will begin with one question, and it's to all of you because it actually picks up on something that each of you was saying in a slightly different way, and then I'll let you kind of have a free-for-all and we'll see where we get to. Which is, it struck me that each of you in different ways were coming at the question of groups within democracy, right, for want of a more elegant way of putting that, thinking about questions of inclusivity. How do we get all groups enfranchised? How do we get them all included in democracy? And from Peter's point about small groups advancing their special interests in order to weaken the power of a monarchy or an oligarchy in order to advance their own, up to Black Lives Matter and each of the points that you made along the way. It struck me that it made me think, actually, and this may sound like a red herring, but it made me think of Madison in the Federalist Papers, because something I've been thinking about, where he warns that the greatest threat to the new American democracy that they were thinking through, in his view, famously, was factionalism. And he defined a faction as a number of citizens who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And then he notes that property is most commonly, the unequal distribution of property in society is most commonly the durable source of factions. And he said that is probably going to be the greatest threat that a democracy will face. But it strikes me that from some of your comments, and some of your comments were picking up on that, obviously, in terms of inequality, and we certainly see the way that plays out in the United States, and what both Carrie Lee and Zoe were talking about in terms of voter suppression and inequality, and the way that those are so closely intertwined in American history. But Sunny and Peter, you both were talking in more affirmative terms about the ways in which small groups can advance their own interests and think through democracy in different ways. So I just kind of want to put is factionalism inevitably divisive? Or is it always going to be zero-sum game because of human nature? Or are there ways in which, I guess I want to put I feel like I've kind of got like Team Zoe and Carrie Lee on one side and Team Peter and Sunny on the other side, but that might be unfair. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts. I don't know if I put that very coherently, but as I say, because it just kind of came out of what you were all saying.
Peter, if you don't mind, I'll just pick up something because it just reminded me what you were saying. So, Sarah, your question or idea, I go back to Camus as a writer. I'm an atheist as a person, but writing is an act of faith because you assume that somebody somewhere will read it, and that's why you write. So by default, as a writer, I'm a person of faith. And that might be somehow this sort of affirmative stance. I don't actually think that automatically a competitive spirit is somehow a given in human beings. I don't think competing over property or wealth and influence is an automatic given. I do think, however, that the structure, and I do want to go back, I use the term necrocapitalism to talk about what the empire constructed, and Peter put it as small interests of small groups of people. But one of the things, necrocapitalism, or the structure we now inhabit or are forced to inhabit, relied on a few things. It relied on an extractive system of wealth creation, distribution, and ownership that requires a finite number of competitors, which were sort of a cartel-like behavior. You know, the empires did that very well. And underpaid and undercost access to resources, whether those are material or human. And I think mass slavery is a good case in point when I talk about resources. And finally, captive markets, which had no other option but to have to constantly keep going. Now, once that starts to disintegrate, which is in some ways has happened, and so we keep talking about end state capitalism, we are kind of living out the end of this. You can't keep this going, but that is the global problem. But it's also an opportunity. I think if we think about how this kind of structure, this necro-capitalist structure is upheld and the democratic narrative is just a gloss over it, we then start to recognize that actually what we need to dismantle is this necro-capitalist structure, rather than worrying about enfranchisement and would people be able to continue, or how would we have people participate in democracy? And I really do think that that's where we need to be focusing, because I think once we are no longer caught by these three factors, it then allows not just individuals, but collectives to function in ways that are not trapped in this cycle of constant exploitation and extraction for the benefit of the few. So over to you.
Well, I think as a historian of the Soviet Union and former Soviet territories and China, I do have an issue about whether collective systems of government produce better outcomes, because in fact, in many ways, those are persecuted in terms of human numbers on a far greater scale than anything else that was seen in the 20th century, at least. So, I think that throwing capitalism under the wheels is an easy way of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's lack of regulation and lack of legislation that can control inequality. I think that's a failure of governments rather than of systems. And in the same way, to Sarah's question about is it a zero-sum game, the problem with political systems, as we see democracies, is that we produce a winner and a loser. There's no second or third choice vote. So if you're a Trump supporter, you either get Trump or you don't get Trump. And so you either get Republican or hardline Republican views in his case, or Joe Biden, and there's no middle space. So we've set the process up to be a rigged, you win or you lose. And if you're a pharmaceutical, if you're a lobbyist, if you're politically active on whichever side of the spectrum, then you have to put all your eggs in one basket, and there's no point in moderating, because you need to produce extremes. So that's one of the reasons why some people in the UK, myself included, believe that second preference votes and a different way of tallying up how you run your democratic elections is part of the answer, where you will have more moderate, more centrist parties, which I think, again, would produce better outcomes because it forces negotiation. So I think that the process of, is it capitalist problems? I'm not as optimistic as Sunny in thinking that change can be manufactured. And because when it has been, it's produced these terrible outcomes. And side to Sunny's point that, you don't think we're competitive and the accumulation of capital, we are highly anthropocentric in how we think about the world. We forget that we human beings are animals, and we behave like animals, and the role of a state and a role of laws and a role of human rights is to protect ourselves from doing the kinds of things that animals do to each other. And that biological process we have is something which, it means that we are unique among species, because of the way we communicate with each other in complex terms. And the upside, the plus sides of what we can do of producing, and I'm giving myself part of the assumed credit for works of literature or of music or of architecture, which I had no responsibility in at all, but that's part of our human legacy. But we also, the rough side of the coin is that if we are not protected from each other, we can behave like animals and treat each other as such. So I think we are biological creatures, and the role of the state and going back deep into antiquity, not just in the Greek tradition, but in Mesopotamia, in South Asian traditions, in Indic philosophies, there's great eloquence about the needs to recognize that we are unique in our humanity, but not to divorce ourselves from the natural world. And we've done that by overconsumption, we've done that through persecution, we've done that through all sorts of different ways, because we have failed to protect ourselves and failed to create a cosmology that works. So I am not unpersuaded, Sunny, about the idea that there is a structural problem, as you say. I'm probably not as radical as thinking that the solutions need to be quite so bad, but it is about that reconceptualizing who we are and where we've come from, and understanding those deep roots properly. And in that sense, the fact that we think about history rather than humanity, or strengthening democracy, these are all arbitrary barriers that we create about how we structure the world. That again, it creates winners and losers, and that, I think, is the problem. Oh, by the way, while I'm on the phone or online, one of the attendees, anonymous, entirely rightly pointed out that I'd said that universal suffrage in the UK end of the 1920s. In fact, that's right. In Northern Ireland, it wasn't the case until the 1960s. But the point I was making at that time was to say that democracy and enlightenment isn't given away like confetti by people who think that's a good idea. It has to be taken, and democracy has to be fought for. Thanks.
So one of the things I look at in researching the South is the positives of this kind of coalition building. As much as I hate that we live in a two-party system, when you look at the history of the South, you actually see this kind of factionalism as a way to extricate some whites from white supremacy itself. I consider myself primarily a labor historian. And so when you look at economic issues and you look at labor issues, and you see that every time there is a major depression in America or a major recession in America, that right after those times of the hardest economic hits in the South, those are the times that you have Black and poor white and any other, as time goes on, different immigrant groups banding together in labor solidarity. And even if you look at the papers of people in the civil rights movement, they're literally going into the most racist places in Mississippi. The way that they're able to actually win Klansmen over is through the labor movement. And so that I think that in a lot of ways, this kind of coalition building is the key to what we do with a multi-racial, multi-ethnic America to make sure that democracy does work.
I have some concerns about the idea of natural human competition, this kind of Hobbesian state of nature where we're all kind of at each other's throats trying to self-preserve. I have some issues with that as someone who's from a former British colony as well. Like my family is all from what was formerly Rhodesia. And within that kind of metaphor, I have a lot of, I'm a bit wary of this, of describing humans as, of course we're animals, of course we're apes, but within my research, there is this very particular production of factionalism by describing Black people, African people, other racialized people around the world, literally as animal-like and animal adjacent. And it is that description of animalism that kind of justified enslavement, that justified the kind of, I guess if we could call white supremacy a kind of factionalism, right? Like in the consideration of these inalienable rights to life and liberty and property, like there were people who were literally written into social contracts as property or altogether excluded from those contracts. And so for maybe the sake of the conversation, I will keep some of my political proposals to myself, but I do think that it is necessary to kind of overhaul the structures and in kind of taking these audits, because we were all there was a sense of relief for some in thinking about Joe Biden as the centrist, as a kind of moderate relief from President Trump. But we know the kind of neoliberal violences that centrism still yields, the disenfranchisement that it fails to prevent, the kind of business interest that it puts over, the preservation of human lives, as we saw in his really, really, really long hesitation to sign on to and agree with and advocate for the waivers of intellectual property for patents for the COVID vaccine. So I think we're kind of past this like slow incremental thing. And I think we've kind of long gone past thinking about centrism as a stopgap measure or as a kind of preventative measure for right-wing politics, because as we've seen across the board, that has never been sufficient to ensure that people are protected, to ensure that people's rights are being maintained, to ensure that people are able to live in the present and the future, and that past grievances and past violences that have structured present day materiality have been sufficiently addressed. I think that, we need to be more ambitious than that politically.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn now to some of the audience questions, but what I'm going to do with the first is actually combine it with something I was going to ask, and also an allusion that Peter made at the top of our conversation, which is certainly going to be on the minds of everyone in the UK, and it has parallels in the US, so it will not be in any way alien to Zoe and Carrie Lee in the American context either. Peter alluded to the fact that we have a government in the UK that is canceling history departments, that is cutting funding to the humanities. It's saying that humanities are low value subjects. That's the phrase that that they've been using. And over the weekend, the UK Culture Secretary, Oliver Dowden, caused something of a furor, as we say in America, or furore, as you say in the UK, with a headline that said, "We won't allow Britain's history to be cancelled," which was an op-ed that implied that it was historians who were canceling history, although we might think we were in the business of history and not actually in the business of canceling it. But of course, the implication of the piece was that they were canceling history by taking down statues. He complained about removing William Gladstone's name from a building. So it's that framing of canceling history. And he says in the piece that that we need to tell a history that doesn't automatically start from a position of guilt and shame, or the denigration of the past. Now, some people saw that and some of these other kinds of conversations as stoking culture wars as a distraction from the handling of the pandemic that has left 130,000 victims dead in the UK. So I want to connect that kind of problem that we face as historians in the ways that history, it's not that history is ever not politicized, but the study of history is now being politicized in certain ways. And the question from the audience from James Levan is, in the United States, but it applies to the UK as well, as I've said, history and the humanities as a whole are being gutted at universities at an alarming rate. Any thoughts on how to reverse this destruction? I would love if we have any thoughts on how to fix it, but also thoughts on how we might usefully, I hope, reframe this debate, because it doesn't seem to me that that the framing serves really anyone's interest, but except perhaps the ones that I alluded to. So any thoughts on canceling history, literally and figuratively?
Well, obviously, I mean, this is a huge deal in the US too, and we're seeing history departments close, left and right. We've seen in the past year or two a spate of professors, tenured professors, some of them who have spoken out politically and been fired from their jobs. So you really do see the freedom of speech by academics really being reined in. I show in my own work, just in general in American history, this is how white elites keep their power, right? This is how white supremacist elites have always kept their power, is by controlling the flow of knowledge. And of course, with knowledge, the most important things for citizens to know in a democracy is history and civics. And so those are the departments they're shutting down. This is the flip side of what we see with the whole Trump fake news and getting you to disbelieve things that are reality and exist in a world of not knowing what's real and what's fake. But I think, in the positive way of how do we kind of conquer this, we've got to think about the fact that the university is for such a small percentage of elites anyway, and we've got to think about how do you democratize knowledge. And so I think that's, for me personally, that is why I will always be a writer. I'll always continue to write books, but I'm trying to move into reaching people who don't read books. I'm trying to move into film. I'm trying to move into documentaries, any other way that I can reach people that don't, have the ability to purchase a book or to, attend a seminar or to go to a college class. So I think that we've really got to concentrate on getting that knowledge out to everyone in society.
I couldn't agree more. I think that in thinking specifically about what it means to try to democratize history, and this new iteration of the culture wars about cancel culture and the cancellation of ideas and of history, I think it's no surprise that the president very specifically went after critical race theory, whatever, and all of the right is kind of rabidly attacking whatever they understand as critical race theory, which is actually has a kind of disciplinary definition, but they're defining it as kind of any conceptualization of history that is foregrounding slavery and is foregrounding Jim Crow and settler colonization and historical discrimination. And I think what's so important about the removal of statues, which once again is not new, is something that has been happening throughout history, is this really hegemonic and very dangerous idea as history being something that is static and as memory as something that is kind of fixed and unchanging, as opposed to something that is constantly in flux, that is constantly being contested. And it is only now that there are more avenues for people to actively contest history. There are more opportunities to put together a package like the 1619 Project for people to for the creation of incredible texts like Black Marxism or the Black Jacobins, or these other ways of kind of challenging what we know to be true, kind of challenging the epistemic foundations of philosophy and sociology and all of these other fields, that there are these complaints about cancellation, right? There's no such thing as like canceling Black people from history, when, the historical record has always omitted anti-colonial resistance, has always omitted the intellectual production of the third world, the so-called third world, right? Like, it's only a cancellation when there is not so much this vice grip on the monopoly of knowledge production. And I think that we should not be baited into those arguments, because I think that I think it's really pretentious to call things a distraction, but it actually is a distraction, right? It is a means of taking time and energy away from these necessary corrections, and instead being kind of mired in debating, the right, in terms of engagement, and in the conceptualization and creation of a world that they think is valid, that I do not believe is valid, that so many people do not believe is valid, that has historically been oppressive and suffocating to all these people. And I think, what Carrie is describing in creating film and documentary and making history accessible to people who are not in the academy, who are not reading these tomes that we're putting out, art, it's incredibly important.
I don't want to cut anybody off from bringing it up, but I'm going to bring in another question and then invite you to, kind of connect them and continue to comment on either one. But I do want to bring in another question from Clint Lawrence, who rightly points out that European political systems dominate college and university study of history, and asks for your thoughts about the potential value of studying indigenous non-Western political systems and history recording in particular. But we can also widen that out, obviously, and in terms of the democratization of knowledge and the democratization of history, widen our conversation to be thinking about indigenous peoples as well, and indeed, in Peter's case, ancient peoples too, but I open it out to you guys.
Okay, so I think, well, yes, of course. I mean, as to pick up from Dr. Samudzi's point, the more people we study, the more, those who have been historically cancelled, who've been erased from history, those are the places we need to be looking at. I'm going to sort of bring it to UK, I think, partly because the culture wars have been imported here. And I completely agree that it's in many ways, it's a distraction, and the way I deal with it is to focus on getting the knowledge out and create knowledge and stay focused on that, rather than debating things on grounds and on parameters and in frameworks and which are really bad faith, which aren't meant to actually have a debate or but are intended as some way to legitimize a point that really has no ground to stand on. But I think the more interesting part, and this is something I think Britain should start thinking about, and I think this is why the culture wars are so heated right now, or are heating up even further, is because I think for many, many years, we've talked about post-colonial studies, and that has tended to been used to describe studies of people who were colonized. I think what needs to start happening is Britain starting to recognize, and British academia starting to, recognizing that Britain is a post-colonial country. Europe is a post-colonial continent. Whether it likes it or not, it's not as if colonization happened over there to those people, and then decolonization, political liberation happened over there and didn't have an impact over here. I think there should be more study, and I'm going to take that away, of what that means for Britons. What does that mean for the Pax, the Union? Is there a point for the Union to exist? Is there a point for the United Kingdom to exist once the purpose of getting together these kingdoms in order to sort of conquer the world is gone? I think if we do think about it, and that's taking it away from considering perhaps the way your the question was posed of what it means to study indigenous people or indigenous knowledge, but let's turn that lens onto Britain and start really looking at what is the issues here rather than the imperial version of history. And I think that would probably yield much more of an understanding of Britain's past, as well as its potential future, whatever that may be, whether as a United Kingdom or separate kingdoms or separate states. But I think that's where we need to go.
Shall I? I'm going to throw in one more. Oh, actually, I'm going to mash up two questions from the audience, and it'll probably be my last question to the panel as a whole. But again, you can come in on any of these points that we've raised. But there are two questions about one of the most urgent political crises right now that has just exploded, to the surprise of some of us, in Israel and Palestine. One question from Amber Lone is, how do current events in Israel and Palestine belie the idea of centrist politics working when today's democracies such as the UK, US, Canada are either silent or militarily and economically supportive of the Israeli state? And then a related question there from Dion Lakey, who wants to think about how this is being handled in schools. Her question is a little bit long, so I'm going to just compress it. And the question is basically that they were learning the Treaty of Versailles, her daughter in year 9, age 14, and they were studying the Treaty of Versailles, and they asked the teacher about what was happening in Palestine and were told it was too sensitive to talk about. And Dion rightly notes that the Versailles Treaty took us to the Balfour Declaration, which takes us to the current situation in the Middle East. And so the question is, could you please speak to the teaching of history in schools and secondary schools? How do we get teachers to engage and to think about such missed opportunities? So a big question, a lot there, but a really important topic.
Well, first of all, the history teacher needs to know that the Balfour Declaration took place in 1917, not at the Treaty of Versailles. So that would be quite a helpful way of dealing with it.
That wasn't the question, but I mean, but the point is that they're interrelated. So that was me misspeaking when I was trying to summarize.
I think that the challenge for teachers is to have access to materials. And that's something which we should do much better, I think, as writers and authors and historians, is to be writing for schools and for younger people. I mean, that's Carrie Lee's point about reaching different audiences. And there are lots of different ways and hundreds of different ways to try to do that. But I think producing more books for younger readers is something that historians really haven't done for forever, you know. And having had kids myself, seeing how much fiction there is, which is great. Obviously, Sunny, I don't want to be rude about fiction at all. So it's not trying to diminish anything else, but there's just nothing available for younger pupils and people who are interested to read. So, you know, I did a kids version of the Silk Roads, and it was really hard to write, to boil things down that was comprehensible and understandable, to explain kind of global history for younger readers. And I'm really pleased that in the last couple of years there have been many more books that are coming out like that. But I think for teachers and for the young minds that are being freshened up, who are deeply curious, they're not yet on the tram lines as young, you know, until they get to about 14, 15, and then suddenly it's about GCSEs and syllabuses and testing and memory skills. You know, the young mind is like blotting paper, but they need to have stuff that they can read. And that's something which I think publishers need to do more of. We historians need to be trying to write it and trying to convince publishers that they should publish our books. And I think that goes some of the way towards getting young people to be thinking about what kind of questions they want to engage with and where do they turn next for information. And right now, to the point that all the other Zoe and Dr. Samudzi, I should say, Zoe and Sunny and Carrie Lee, you know, it's about democratization of knowledge. And I think that is a challenge we have in the academic world, of over regulating. We have the certificate fetish where, you know, we sort of test and test and test, and we use arcane language. I know one of the questions asks about that too, that we sometimes are our own worst enemies. And events like this, you know, they're not easy to do when a single miscomment or something you didn't mean or something you didn't explain quite clearly enough suddenly gets recorded and kept in the ether. It's really hard. It's much easier to just turn down invitations where you can try and have conversations to push things through. And, you know, I think it can be thankless, but it requires historians to be brave, to be trying to get out there and to make documentaries, to write books for different audiences, to reach different people. But teachers need to have those materials, and young people need to be asked what kind of questions they want to know about. Where are their histories? And it gets led from the bottom up rather than this old-fashioned top down.
I mean, I think part of the difficulty in being able to teach, you know, the entire history of Israel and Palestine, there are a couple of things. I think one of them is the kind of insistence on framing all geopolitical conflicts as, or all geopolitical, antagonistic, whatever, conflictual geopolitical interactions as wars or as conflicts, as opposed to kind of considering the dynamics of power between parties that are in tension with one another, right? So this is not a conflict, right? This is a historical settler colonial state, and engaging in the ongoing dispossession of land. And there are, you know, every once in a while, particularly acute flare-ups, but that this is something that has been ongoing for the past 70 plus years. And in that framing, there are fears of explaining history in that particular way, because, you know, in the United States, we've seen with Stephen Saleda, with Norm Finkelstein, with a whole number of historians, a whole number of academics being actively punished and censured and fired and ostracized for having the courage to be in solidarity with Palestinian people and to describe Israeli state politics as what they are. And I'm sure that trickles down to secondary school. And, you know, in the United States, we have, or globally, there's the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, where it's like, if you describe Israel in a particular way, then, you know, it is tantamount to anti-Semitism, and that is enough for someone to lose their job. So there are all of these other external factors, in addition to, as Peter rightly pointed out, the lack of resources that are informing the way that curricula are constructed and informing the way that people speak publicly about certain kind of global goings on.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. It's gone so fast. I have so many other questions. I want to talk to Sunny about Otto Golpe, and I wanted to talk about Modi, and I had all the stuff I was going to talk about. But it's actually a good sign. And obviously, there's still a lot of knowledge and a lot of thinking that we all have to do. So I want to ask, this is not actually necessarily an easy question, but you can give it a yes/no answer if you want to. I'm going to ask each of you to answer the same question, but it will have to be very brief, please, if you want to go slightly beyond the yes/no. But do we think that if we are successful in democratizing our approach to knowledge and our approach to history in the way that we've been talking about, if we can tell history more inclusively and tell more stories, to put it in its kind of simplest terms, do we think that will strengthen our democratic discourses, or are they disconnected? So I say you can make that a yes, no, or slightly elaborate, but please keep your answers brief. And let's go in reverse order. So I'll go Dr. Samudzi first. You're getting the most formal of everybody.
No, I don't think that telling more stories in itself is kind of pro-democracy. I think it's about the kind of epistemological core and the foundation upon which all of these stories are built, and the dynamics of power that decide whose stories are told and how and when.
Sunny?
I'm going to agree with, well, I'll say yes, but also agree partly with Zoe, Dr. Samudzi, partly because, and I'll say, I think the more stories we have, the better, but it does matter whose stories are told, but more also who gets to tell them. And those are linked to power and power structures. But if we can tell more stories by the people who should be telling them, and of the people who they're telling stories about, I think that can strengthen democracies. The more voices, the better.
Dr. Merritt?
Simply put, yes. Yes. Again, yes, power dynamics, all of that plays into it, but we need more, and we need, especially in America, we need just a complete redo of American history told from the perspectives of all the different kinds of Americans.
Here, here. And I'm going to democratize you, Peter, and call you Peter.
I agree with all three of my rather brilliant speakers. It's been a pleasure to listen and to learn. So thank you for including me in the panel. I think that I've got nothing that I can add, but I think that the eloquence of making me and others, I'm sure in the audience, think is a real privilege. So thank you for having me too.
Thank you all very much for coming. It was really a pleasure. And like Peter, I learned an immense amount and so much food for thought there. I was typing away madly like Kermit in the GIF. My own answer to the question about the cancellation of history is not my own answer. It comes from the great historian Nell Painter. And I thought she put it incredibly succinctly when she said, history doesn't change, the questions we ask change. Which is what you, I think, have all modeled beautifully for us tonight, and shown what happens when we ask different questions, and how that can generate different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of understanding. So thank you all very much. Honestly, I could keep going listening to you guys for hours, but we are out of time. I may try to make you do this again someday, but thank you all very much. And thanks again to the audience for joining us and for your really terrific questions, and hope to see you all soon. Take care. Good night.